"Stop the ceremony," one of the nobles said with a bitter laugh. "Why waste a royal wedding on an Omega no one even wanted?" The words echoed through the vaulted hall like a sentence already passed, drawing quiet chuckles from rows of elegantly dressed guests who had traveled across the kingdom to witness what everyone believed would become the saddest marriage in royal history. Emily Carter lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat before lifting them again, calm and steady, refusing to let anyone see the weight those words carried. At 24 years old, she had spent her entire life learning that silence often survived longer than anger. Her ivory wedding gown was simple compared to the glittering jewels surrounding her, and the silver ribbon tied around her waist marked her as an Omega, a symbol many in the kingdom considered a weakness rather than a blessing. She could feel dozens of eyes studying her, measuring her worth before she had spoken a single word. No one greeted her with kindness. No one wished her happiness. To them, she was merely the unwanted daughter of a fading noble family, offered to a dying king because no one else would accept such a fate. At the far end of the grand cathedral stood the throne, and beside it rested a carved oak chair where King Alexander Hayes remained seated in complete silence. The once legendary Alpha who had defended the kingdom from countless battles now looked pale beneath the soft morning light streaming through stained glass windows. His broad shoulders remained proud despite obvious exhaustion, while a dark ceremonial cloak concealed the injuries that had confined him for months. Rumors had spread faster than truth ever could. Some whispered that a cursed wound slowly drained his life. Others claimed the moon itself had abandoned him. Royal healers had traveled hundreds of miles from neighboring kingdoms, each promising miracles before quietly admitting defeat. Every failure strengthened the belief that the king would never recover. Emily had never met Alexander before this morning, yet she already knew everyone expected her to become a widow before the year ended. As the High Elder stepped forward to begin the sacred vows, another noblewoman leaned toward her companion and whispered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "She won't even make it through winter before she's sent back home." More laughter followed. Emily inhaled slowly, keeping her breathing steady while memories threatened to surface. Years of hearing she was too ordinary, too quiet, too insignificant to matter. Today those voices returned wearing crowns and velvet robes instead of familiar faces. The elder raised the ceremonial ribbon joining the bride and groom, asking them to place their hands together beneath the ancient blessing of the moon. Alexander's hand remained motionless until one of his royal guards carefully guided it forward. Emily hesitated for only an instant before gently resting her fingertips against his. The cathedral remained perfectly still. Then something impossible happened. Beneath their joined hands, hidden from nearly every eye in the room, a faint silver glow shimmered across Alexander's wrist before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Emily felt a warmth travel through her fingertips like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. Alexander's breathing, strained only moments before, became unexpectedly calm. His fingers moved almost imperceptibly, as though responding to a forgotten memory. Emily's heart skipped. Had she imagined it? Before she could gather another thought, Alexander's closed eyes opened for the first time that morning. They met hers with quiet intensity, filled not with fear, but recognition. His lips barely moved as he whispered words no one else seemed to hear. "Don't let them know you're the one." A heartbeat later, his eyes closed again, and the silence returned, leaving Emily standing beneath the kingdom's judgment while unknowingly carrying the first secret that could change its future forever. The wedding guests slowly disappeared behind towering oak doors, but the uneasiness lingering inside the cathedral seemed to follow Emily all the way through the endless stone corridors of the royal palace. Every servant who passed lowered their head before the royal crest, yet avoided looking directly at the kingdom's newest queen. Their silence was polite, but it carried the unmistakable weight of doubt. Emily noticed it immediately. They were not welcoming her. They were waiting to see how long she would last. 2 royal guards escorted her through polished marble halls lined with portraits of generations of Alpha rulers, whose confident expressions overlooked every step she took. None of those paintings included an Omega queen. None of them looked remotely like her. At last, they stopped before a pair of carved walnut doors decorated with silver wolves beneath a full moon. One guard opened the entrance without saying a word. Inside, The room was quiet except for the soft crackling of a fireplace. King Alexander Hayes rested upon a large bed positioned beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the palace gardens. The golden afternoon light revealed how pale he had become. His breathing remained slow and controlled, but there was a heaviness in every breath that made the room itself seem tired. 3 royal healers stood nearby, examining glass bottles filled with colorful herbal mixtures while speaking in hushed voices. None of them greeted Emily when she entered. Instead, the eldest healer glanced toward her with visible skepticism before returning his attention to the king. "Your Majesty should avoid unnecessary visitors," he said coldly, making it obvious he did not consider Emily part of the king's recovery. Before Emily could answer, another voice interrupted from across the chamber. Queen Mother Victoria Hayes entered with graceful confidence, followed by Commander Nathan Brooks, captain of the Royal Guard. Victoria's elegant smile never reached her eyes. She studied Emily from head to toe before speaking in a calm tone that somehow felt sharper than shouting. "You have fulfilled your purpose," she said. "The marriage has secured political stability. You may stay in the palace, but the king's treatment remains the responsibility of experienced hands." Emily nodded respectfully without arguing. She understood that challenging anyone on her first day would accomplish nothing. Commander Brooks folded his arms and quietly added, "His Majesty has survived every healer this kingdom could summon. Do not mistake your presence for significance." Emily simply looked toward Alexander. She remembered the impossible warmth she had felt during the ceremony and the whispered warning only she had heard. "Do not let them know you are the one." Those words echoed through her thoughts with every heartbeat. As the Queen Mother and the healers continued discussing medicines and schedules, Emily walked toward the bedside carrying nothing except a small pitcher of fresh water. One of the younger servants instinctively stepped aside, allowing her to replace the untouched glass resting on the nightstand. Her fingers brushed Alexander's hand for only a fraction of a second. Once again, that same faint warmth traveled through her palm. Almost instantly, the tension visible across Alexander's face softened. His breathing became steadier. A nearby candle flickered as though stirred by an invisible breeze. Emily quietly withdrew her hand before anyone noticed. One of the healers looked up in surprise. "Strange," he murmured. "His pulse is stronger than it was this morning." Another healer quickly dismissed the observation. "Temporary fluctuations mean nothing." The Queen Mother accepted that explanation without another thought, but Emily remained perfectly still. She had felt the change. More importantly, Alexander had felt it too. Although his eyes remained closed, the corners of his fingers curled ever so slightly, almost as if reaching for the comforting presence that had already begun pulling him back from the edge of a darkness no one else in the room yet understood. Morning settled gently over the palace, but peace never truly reached the royal residence. Emily quickly discovered that every hallway carried whispers long before it carried footsteps. Servants lowered their voices whenever she approached, only to resume their conversations after she passed. Some pitied her. Others quietly questioned why an Omega had been allowed to marry the most powerful Alpha in the kingdom. None of them realized she could hear nearly every word. During breakfast, Emily was escorted to a private dining room instead of the royal table. The explanation sounded courteous. The Queen Mother preferred to keep the king's recovery free from distractions. Yet the message beneath those polished words was unmistakable. Emily was not considered part of the royal family. She was merely someone fulfilling an obligation. While she quietly finished her tea, Commander Nathan Brooks entered with his usual composed expression. He placed a sealed document onto the table before speaking. "These are the palace regulations," he said. "The king's chambers are restricted. You may visit only when authorized by the royal council or the senior healers." Emily looked at the document without touching it. "I am his wife," she answered softly. Nathan's expression did not change. "You are his wife by ceremony. The kingdom is depending upon experienced judgment, not emotion." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked away. Emily watched the doors close behind him, feeling the invisible walls around her becoming taller with every passing hour. Later that afternoon, she wandered through one of the palace gardens, where white roses climbed ancient stone archways overlooking a quiet, reflecting pool. It should have been the most peaceful place in the kingdom, yet even there she could not escape the growing tension surrounding the throne. Two noble women strolled nearby, unaware she was close enough to hear them. They say the Queen Mother is already preparing for succession, one whispered. If the king does not recover soon, everything changes. The other nodded. And the Omega? She is only a symbol. She will disappear once this is over. Emily continued walking without interrupting them, but those words settled heavily inside her heart. As the afternoon faded into evening, she returned to Alexander's chambers carrying fresh flowers gathered from the garden. A young palace servant named Lily hesitated before opening the door. Unlike the others, Lily offered Emily a genuine smile. His Majesty seemed calmer today, she whispered. The healers cannot explain it. Emily thanked her and stepped inside. The room was nearly empty except for the steady glow of lanterns and the quiet sound of rain beginning outside the tall windows. Alexander remained asleep, his expression peaceful in a way she had not seen before. Emily carefully replaced the fading flowers beside the window with fresh white lilies. As she adjusted the vase, she noticed something unusual on the bedside table. A silver cup containing the king's evening medicine gave off a faint bitter scent that seemed strangely different from the herbal remedies she had noticed earlier. She had spent years helping her grandmother prepare natural remedies back home, and this mixture carried an unfamiliar sharpness beneath its fragrance. One of the royal healers entered moments later, immediately lifting the cup before Emily could examine it further. The king's treatment is not your concern, he said politely, though his eyes carried unmistakable suspicion. Emily apologized and stepped back, yet her thoughts refused to let go of that strange scent. As the healer approached Alexander, a single question echoed through her mind. What if the greatest threat to the king was not the wound everyone feared, but something placed beside his bed every single day without anyone daring to question it? That night the palace settled into an uneasy silence, the kind that felt less like peace and more like everyone holding the same anxious breath. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while distant thunder rolled across the hills beyond the castle walls. Emily remained awake in the small suite that had been prepared for her, unable to forget the strange scent lingering from the king's medicine or the quiet warning Alexander had whispered during the wedding. Neither memory would leave her alone. Just before midnight, a gentle knock came at her door. It was Lily carrying a fresh blanket and a warm cup of herbal tea. His Majesty has been restless again, she whispered. The healers have already visited twice. Emily thanked her and, after Lily quietly departed, found herself staring toward the hallway leading to Alexander's chambers. Something deep inside urged her to go, not out of curiosity, but because an unexplainable pull seemed to grow stronger with every passing hour. The corridors were nearly empty as she walked beneath flickering lanterns that painted soft golden reflections across the polished stone floor. Two guards stood outside the king's room. One recognized her and politely stepped aside without speaking. Inside, the chamber was dim except for the glow of a single fireplace. Alexander remained asleep, though his breathing sounded uneven once again. The evening medicine rested untouched beside the bed. Emily slowly approached, careful not to disturb anything. She reached toward the blanket that had slipped slightly from his shoulder, intending only to pull it back into place. The instant her fingertips brushed the back of his hand, warmth rushed through her entire body with startling intensity. It did not burn. It felt like standing beneath the first sunlight after a long winter. Silver light shimmered beneath her skin for the briefest moment before flowing into Alexander's hand, like moonlight carried by water. Emily gasped softly and instinctively pulled away, but the connection lingered another heartbeat before fading. Almost immediately Alexander's breathing steadied. The tension around his eyes relaxed. Even the deep lines of exhaustion across his face softened as though invisible weight had quietly lifted away. Emily stared in disbelief at her own trembling hands. They now felt strangely cold, as if every trace of that comforting warmth had left her and settled within the king instead. She took one careful step backward and nearly lost her balance before catching herself against a nearby chair. A wave of exhaustion swept through her so suddenly that she had to close her eyes for several seconds. When she opened them again, Alexander had not awakened, but the peaceful expression on his face remained. Emily remembered stories her grandmother used to tell beside the fireplace when she was a little girl. Legends spoke of rare moonborn omegas whose gifts were never displayed through strength or command, but through sacrifice. Their healing could restore another soul, yet every miracle demanded part of their own energy in return. Emily had always believed those stories belonged beside fairy tales, comforting children on cold evenings. Standing beside the king's bed, she no longer believed they were merely stories. She quietly wrapped her hands together, hiding the faint silver glow that still pulsed beneath her fingertips before finally disappearing. No one could know what had just happened. If the Queen Mother, the healers, or anyone within the royal council discovered this secret before she understood it herself, she feared her gift would become something to control rather than something freely given. As she turned to leave, Alexander's lips moved ever so slightly. Though his eyes remained closed, one quiet sentence drifted into the stillness. "You came back." Emily froze in place, realizing he had sensed her presence even in sleep, and for the first time she understood that whatever connected them had already begun changing both of their lives. The following morning the palace awoke beneath clear blue skies, yet the mood inside the royal residence had changed in ways no one could explain. Before sunrise, the senior healers gathered around Alexander's bedside for their daily examination, expecting another disappointing report. Instead, they exchanged puzzled glances as each measured the same unexpected result. His heartbeat was steadier. His breathing no longer struggled through every minute. Even the unnatural chill that had surrounded him for months seemed noticeably weaker. The eldest healer adjusted his spectacles before checking the readings a second time. "Remarkable," he murmured. "His condition has improved overnight." Another healer quickly searched through handwritten records from previous weeks, convinced a mistake had been made. "There has been no new treatment," he insisted. Nothing should have changed. Standing quietly near the doorway, Emily lowered her eyes and said nothing. She could still feel the lingering exhaustion from the previous night. Simply climbing the palace staircase that morning had left her unusually tired, forcing her to pause twice before reaching the king's chamber. She hid her weariness behind a gentle smile whenever anyone looked her way. Queen Mother Victoria arrived moments later with Commander Nathan Brooks beside her. The Queen Mother listened carefully as the healers described the king's unexpected improvement. Relief briefly softened her expression before caution quickly replaced it. "Continue the same treatment," she instructed. "Do not celebrate too early. We have seen false hope before." The healers bowed respectfully, but uncertainty remained visible on every face. None of them could explain why the king appeared stronger despite receiving exactly the same medicines. As the room slowly emptied, Lily approached Emily while arranging fresh towels beside the fireplace. She lowered her voice until only Emily could hear. "His Majesty slept through the entire night," she whispered with quiet amazement. "That has not happened in many months." Emily smiled gently, but offered no explanation. Instead, she walked toward the open window where cool morning air carried the scent of pine trees from the distant hills. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe Alexander truly might recover. Then her attention drifted toward the silver medicine cup resting once again upon the bedside table. It had already been refilled. The same faint bitter scent lingered beneath the stronger fragrance of herbs. Emily recognized it immediately. Whatever she had noticed the previous evening had returned. Her thoughts were interrupted by Alexander's quiet voice. It was barely louder than a whisper, but this time his eyes opened for several seconds. They appeared clearer than before, no longer clouded entirely by exhaustion. He looked directly at Emily. "The garden," he said slowly. "I dreamed of the garden." Emily stepped closer, surprised he had spoken at all. "Was it peaceful?" she asked softly. A faint smile touched his face before disappearing again. "You were there." Before she could answer, one of the healers hurried back into the room. Alexander's eyes closed almost immediately, leaving the brief conversation behind like a dream fading with daylight. The healer examined the king once more and smiled with growing confidence. "His Majesty is responding at last," he declared. "Perhaps the curse is finally weakening." Emily remained silent, though something inside her resisted that conclusion. Curses did not usually retreat without reason. As everyone focused on celebrating the first signs of hope, she noticed another detail no one else seemed to question. The medicine cup that had been sitting beside the bed only moments earlier was gone. No servant admitted removing it. No healer mentioned taking it away. Yet the table where it had rested stood completely empty, as though someone had quietly erased the very object Emily had begun to suspect the most. By the third morning, the palace no longer felt exactly the same. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet everyone seemed to sense that an invisible current had begun shifting beneath the routines they had followed for months. The royal healers spoke with greater confidence. Servants smiled a little more easily. Even the guards outside the king's chambers stood with quiet optimism instead of silent resignation. Still, no one understood why the impossible recovery had begun. Emily carried a fresh arrangement of white lilies into Alexander's room just after sunrise. She had barely crossed the doorway when Alexander slowly opened his eyes without anyone calling his name. The movement surprised every healer in the room. For several long seconds, he remained fully awake, calmly looking around as though returning from an extraordinarily distant journey. His gaze finally settled on Emily. He did not look at the healers. He did not acknowledge Commander Nathan Brooks, standing nearby. His attention rested entirely on her. "You came," he said quietly. It was the clearest sentence anyone had heard him speak in many weeks. Emily stepped closer, placing the flowers beside the window. "I said I would," she answered with a gentle smile. A faint expression of relief crossed Alexander's face before he slowly closed his eyes again to rest. The exchange lasted only moments, but everyone in the room noticed it. One of the younger healers looked toward Emily with open confusion. "His Majesty has barely recognized anyone since his illness began," he whispered. "Yet he remembers you." Commander Brooks folded his arms, watching silently without revealing his thoughts. Queen Mother Victoria, however, seemed less comforted than concerned. "Coincidences happen," she said evenly. "Do not assign meaning where there is none." Emily offered no argument. She simply remained beside the bed while the physicians completed their examinations. As they discussed pulse rates and breathing patterns, she quietly noticed something else. Alexander appeared most comfortable whenever she stood nearby. The moment she stepped back toward the far side of the room, his breathing grew slightly heavier again. When she returned to adjust the blanket near his shoulder, his expression relaxed almost immediately. The change was subtle enough that only someone carefully watching would recognize it. Emily wished she could convince herself it was imagination, but the pattern repeated itself again and again. Later that afternoon, Lily found Emily reading alone in the palace library. The young servant looked unusually excited. "Everyone is talking," she whispered. "Some believe the moon has blessed the king again. Others think one of the healers finally discovered the right remedy." Emily closed the old history book resting on her lap. "And what do you believe?" Lily hesitated before smiling shyly. "I think His Majesty simply seems happiest whenever you are close." Emily felt warmth rise to her cheeks, but quickly looked away. Before she could answer, palace bells rang through the corridors announcing the evening council meeting. As nobles and advisors gathered inside the great chamber to discuss the king's improving condition, Emily quietly returned toward Alexander's room. She paused outside the half-open door after hearing unfamiliar voices inside. Two senior healers were speaking in low, careful tones. "It makes no sense," one admitted. "Every test says he should still be declining." The other answered even more softly. "Then perhaps someone is helping him in a way we have not yet discovered." Emily remained perfectly still in the hallway. She had intended to enter the room, but those words rooted her in place. For the first time, she realized she was no longer the only person beginning to suspect that the king's recovery could not be explained by medicine alone. The next evening, a thick layer of fog settled over the palace grounds, wrapping the towers in pale silver until the entire castle seemed suspended between dream and reality. Inside the royal residence, however, the atmosphere had become strangely tense. Servants spoke in careful whispers, and every messenger moved through the halls with unusual urgency. Emily sensed the change long before anyone explained it. Shortly after sunset, Lily hurried into her sitting room, her face noticeably pale. "The king became ill again after the evening medicine," she said quietly. "The healers are already with him." Emily stood immediately, her heart tightening as she followed Lily through the winding corridors. When they reached Alexander's chamber, several physicians surrounded the bed, studying bottles, notes, and herbal mixtures spread across a nearby table. Commander Nathan Brooks stood beside the fireplace with folded arms while Queen Mother Victoria watched silently from the window. No one noticed Emily enter until the eldest healer spoke without looking up. "The improvement has stopped," he announced. His Majesty's pulse weakened shortly after tonight's treatment. Emily's eyes moved instinctively toward the silver medicine cup resting beside the bed. The same bitter scent lingered beneath the herbs, stronger than before. This time she was certain she recognized it. It did not belong with the other ingredients. Her grandmother had once warned her about certain mountain plants whose fragrance disappeared beneath sweeter herbs while quietly overwhelming everything they touched. Emily stepped forward before she could stop herself. "May I see the cup?" she asked gently. Every conversation in the room ended at once. The eldest healer slowly turned toward her, clearly surprised by the request. Before he could answer, Queen Mother Victoria spoke first. "There is no reason for you to examine royal medicine." Emily remained respectful. "I only noticed an unfamiliar scent." Commander Brooks exchanged a brief glance with the healers before one of them gave a dismissive smile. "Herbal mixtures often change depending upon the season," he explained. "There is nothing unusual here." Emily lowered her eyes, yet doubt remained firmly planted in her thoughts. Alexander suddenly stirred, his breathing becoming uneven again. Without thinking, Emily quietly approached the bedside and gently rested her hand against the blanket near his arm. She did not even touch his skin. Even so, Alexander slowly relaxed, his breathing growing steadier once more. The youngest healer noticed the change immediately. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern. He looked toward the older physicians as though silently asking a question he did not dare speak aloud. Emily stepped back before anyone could comment, but she sensed she had already drawn unwanted attention. As the physicians continued discussing medicines, she quietly observed another detail. The servant responsible for bringing the evening remedies stood near the doorway, clutching an empty wooden tray. His eyes never once met the king. Instead, they repeatedly drifted toward the Queen Mother before quickly looking away again. The exchange lasted only a moment, yet Emily did not miss it. Neither did Lily, who happened to be standing beside her. Much later that night, after most of the palace had gone to sleep, Emily returned alone to the corridor outside Alexander's chamber. A faint light still glowed beneath the door. As she approached, she heard footsteps retreating farther down the hallway. Turning the corner, she caught sight of a dark figure disappearing into the shadows, carrying what looked unmistakably like the same silver medicine cup that should have remained beside the king's bed. Whoever it was moved quickly, as though determined not to be seen, leaving Emily with the unsettling realization that someone inside the palace was hiding far more than a simple remedy. Emily barely slept before dawn arrived. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mysterious figure disappearing into the shadows with the silver cup. The image lingered like a question refusing to be answered. When the first light of morning reached her window, she quietly made her way to the palace gardens, hoping the cool air would steady her thoughts. Dew rested on every rose, and the gentle sound of a nearby fountain softened the silence surrounding the ancient stone paths. It reminded her of another garden many years ago, one far smaller and far humbler than this royal estate. She had been only 10 years old when her grandmother first taught her the names of healing plants growing behind their cottage. While other children practiced ceremonies expected of noble families, Emily spent afternoons learning how different leaves carried different scents, how some flowers restored strength, while others quietly weakened the body if mixed carelessly. Her grandmother always repeated the same lesson. Real healing begins with paying attention. The smallest detail often protects the greatest life. Emily smiled faintly at the memory before another one replaced it. She remembered standing beside her parents during an important family gathering when relatives proudly praised every alpha and beta child for their confidence, their strength, and their futures. When someone finally asked about Emily, her mother had answered with a tired smile that never reached her eyes. "She is gentle," she had said. "Perhaps that will be enough one day." No one argued. No one expected anything more from an Omega daughter. Emily had carried those words for years, believing kindness alone could never change a person's destiny. Now, standing inside the palace where every decision could shape an entire kingdom, she wondered whether her grandmother had seen something no one else ever had. Lily soon found her sitting beside the fountain. "His Majesty is asking for fresh air today," she said with obvious excitement. The healers think he may soon be able to leave his room for short walks. Emily looked toward the palace windows overlooking the gardens. Hope warmed her heart, yet concern remained close behind it. If Alexander truly recovered while someone continued secretly changing his medicine, the danger had not disappeared. It had only become more difficult to recognize. Later that afternoon, Emily visited the royal library, searching for old botanical records, dust-covered shelves that had not been disturbed in years. She carefully opened one leather-bound volume after another until she found a chapter describing rare mountain herbs. One illustration immediately caught her attention. The dried leaves looked almost identical to those her grandmother had warned her about as a child. According to the handwritten notes beneath the drawing, the herb carried a naturally sweet fragrance that concealed a lingering bitter trace. In very small amounts, it weakened the body gradually without drawing immediate suspicion. Emily slowly closed the book, her heartbeat growing louder than the quiet room around her. She was no longer relying on instinct alone. She now had reason to believe someone might be placing that herb into the king's treatment. As she carefully returned the volume to its shelf, an old folded parchment slipped from between its pages and drifted onto the floor. Curious, she unfolded it. Instead of botanical notes, she discovered part of an ancient prophecy written in faded silver ink. One sentence remained perfectly readable despite its age. When the last moon-born Omega joins hands with the wounded king, forgotten light shall awaken before the crown remembers its true guardian. Emily stared silently at the words, realizing they described a meeting that sounded impossibly similar to the moment her hand had first touched Alexander's during their wedding ceremony. Emily carefully folded the ancient parchment and slipped it inside the sleeve of her dress before anyone could discover it. The faded words echoed through her thoughts long after she left the library. Last moon-born Omega. Forgotten light. True guardian. None of it felt like coincidence anymore. As evening settled over the palace, dark clouds gathered beyond the mountains, covering the moon behind a curtain of gray. The corridors became unusually busy as royal advisors arrived for another council meeting to discuss the king's condition. Everyone spoke about numbers, treatments, and hopeful signs, yet no one questioned why those improvements came and went without explanation. Emily quietly returned to Alexander's chambers carrying a fresh lantern after the servants finished preparing the room for the night. Lily greeted her with a worried smile. His Majesty was stronger this afternoon, she whispered. But after the evening medicine, he became weak again. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Once more the pattern had repeated itself. She waited until the physicians completed their examination before stepping closer to the bed. Alexander's breathing sounded heavier than it had only hours before. His face had once again grown pale beneath the warm firelight. The silver cup rested on the bedside table, already empty. Emily stared at it for a long moment before looking back at Alexander. She could not prove anyone intended harm, but she could no longer ignore what every instinct told her. When the room finally emptied, leaving only the quiet sound of the fireplace, Emily moved beside the bed and gently reached for Alexander's hand. The instant their fingers touched, the familiar warmth returned, stronger than ever before. Soft silver light spread beneath her skin, flowing slowly into his hand like a quiet stream reflecting moonlight. Alexander's breathing immediately steadied, but this time the change did not stop there. Color gradually returned to his face. His shoulders relaxed. His heartbeat, once slow and uneven, settled into a calm and steady rhythm. Emily closed her eyes, allowing the mysterious energy to continue flowing even as exhaustion spread through her own body. Every passing second felt heavier. Her arms became weak. Her knees trembled beneath her. It was as though every ounce of strength leaving her found its way into the king. She remembered her grandmother's words with perfect clarity. Every miracle asks for something in return. Emily understood them now in a way she never had before. Tears quietly gathered in her eyes, not from fear, but from realizing the price this gift demanded. Still, she refused to let go. If this connection truly gave Alexander another chance to live, she would endure the weakness without regret. Several moments later, Alexander slowly opened his eyes. For the first time, they were completely clear. He looked directly at Emily with quiet recognition. "You look tired," he said softly, his voice steadier than it had been since their wedding day. Emily managed a gentle smile despite the growing heaviness in her body. "I am all right," she answered, though even she could hear how faint her voice had become. Alexander lifted his free hand only a few inches before it came to rest again. Yet that simple movement would have been impossible only days earlier. Hope filled the room like the first sunrise after a long winter. Then footsteps echoed outside the chamber. Emily quickly released his hand just before the door opened. Queen Mother Victoria entered with Commander Nathan Brooks and the senior healers. Every person in the room froze. Alexander was sitting slightly upright against his pillows, awake and fully conscious. None of them could remember the last time they had seen him like this. The eldest healer stared in disbelief before whispering the only words that came to his mind. This should not be possible. Silence settled over the chamber with a weight no one dared disturb. The senior healers stared at Alexander as though they were looking at someone who had returned from another world. Only hours earlier they had feared another setback. Now the king was sitting upright, his breathing calm, his eyes focused, and the strength in his voice unmistakably real. Queen Mother Victoria slowly stepped toward the bed, searching her son's face for any sign that this remarkable recovery might vanish as suddenly as it had appeared. "Alexander," she said softly, "do you know where you are?" A faint smile crossed his face. "I am exactly where I belong." The room remained frozen. Commander Nathan Brooks lowered his head with visible relief before quickly returning to his disciplined posture. The eldest healer hurried forward, carefully checking the king's pulse once more. His hands trembled slightly. "This is extraordinary," he whispered. "The weakness that has plagued His Majesty for months has almost disappeared." Another healer examined Alexander's eyes before quietly shaking his head in disbelief. "There is no medical explanation for this." Emily remained near the fireplace, exhausted but careful not to draw attention to herself. She could still feel the lingering emptiness left behind after sharing so much of her own strength only moments earlier. Her hands felt cold despite the warmth of the fire, and every breath required more effort than usual. She kept her composure, determined that no one would notice the cost of what had happened. Alexander's eyes slowly found hers across the room. There was gratitude in his expression, but there was also understanding. He remembered more than he allowed anyone else to know. Before either of them could speak, an elderly figure entered the chamber wearing long silver robes embroidered with ancient lunar symbols. Every person in the room immediately bowed their head. It was Elder Samuel Ashcroft, the oldest keeper of the kingdom's sacred archives, a man rarely seen outside the Hall of Records. His quiet voice carried unexpected authority. "I asked to see the king as soon as I heard the reports." The Queen Mother welcomed him forward without hesitation. Samuel approached Alexander, studying him carefully before his attention shifted toward Emily. He watched her for several long moments, saying nothing. Finally, he spoke words that caused every person in the room to look at her instead. "Young lady, may I see your right hand?" Emily hesitated only briefly before extending it. Samuel gently turned her palm upward. For an instant, nothing happened. Then, beneath the soft candlelight, a delicate silver pattern shimmered faintly beneath her skin before fading again. The elder closed his eyes as though confirming something he had hoped never to witness, and yet had spent his entire life searching for. "It is true," he said quietly. The old bloodline did not disappear. Confused voices immediately filled the chamber. Commander Brooks frowned. The healers exchanged puzzled glances. Even Queen Mother Victoria looked unsettled. Samuel raised one hand, asking for silence before continuing. "The royal records speak of moonborn omegas whose gifts awaken only when the kingdom's chosen alpha stands between life and despair. Their healing was never ordinary. It required sacrifice, compassion, and a bond stronger than power itself." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. The ancient prophecy hidden inside her sleeve suddenly carried terrifying new meaning. Samuel looked directly into her eyes. "You are not simply an Omega, Emily Carter. You are the last known descendant of the Moonborn line." Before anyone could respond, the chamber doors suddenly opened once again. A palace messenger hurried inside, breathing heavily after running through the castle. He bowed quickly before speaking. "Your Majesty, there has been a serious discovery inside the royal apothecary. Several medicine records have disappeared, and one of the storage cabinets was found unlocked just before dawn." The messenger's announcement erased every trace of celebration from the chamber. Alexander's expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable determination in his eyes, a strength the palace had not witnessed for many months. He slowly rose from the edge of the bed with the assistance of a carved walking staff resting beside him. The senior healers instinctively moved forward, prepared to stop him, but Alexander raised one hand. "I have spent enough time lying still," he said firmly. "Take me to the royal apothecary." The Queen Mother hesitated, clearly concerned that he was pushing himself too quickly, yet even she recognized the quiet authority returning to her son's voice. Commander Nathan Brooks immediately ordered several guards to secure every entrance leading to the medical storage rooms. Emily followed several steps behind the royal party, still weakened from the previous evening but unwilling to remain behind. The long corridor leading to the apothecary felt colder than the rest of the palace. Shelves filled with dried herbs, carefully labeled bottles, and handwritten treatment journals lined every wall. The chief pharmacist stood nervously beside an open cabinet whose brass lock had been damaged. Several record books lay scattered across a large wooden table. Elder Samuel carefully examined the room before lifting one of the remaining ledgers. His experienced eyes quickly noticed missing pages. "These entries were removed deliberately," he said quietly. "Someone wanted to erase part of the treatment history." Emily slowly approached another shelf where rows of sealed glass jars remained perfectly organized. One nearly empty container immediately caught her attention. She recognized the same dried leaves illustrated in the ancient botanical book she had studied only the day before. The sweet fragrance concealed the familiar bitter note she had detected in Alexander's medicine. She gently lifted the jar and looked toward Samuel. "This is the herb I smelled," she said softly. Samuel examined it closely before his expression grew solemn. "In skilled hands, this plant has legitimate medicinal uses," he explained. "But if prepared incorrectly over many weeks, it quietly drains strength instead of restoring it." The room fell silent. Every healer looked at one another with growing disbelief. None of them had authorized this ingredient for the king's treatment. Commander Brooks immediately questioned the chief pharmacist, who nervously insisted the herb had not been requested through official records. Then Lily stepped forward from the doorway, her hands trembling slightly. "I remembered something," she whispered. "Several nights ago, I saw someone entering this room long after the evening staff had left. I thought it was unusual, but I was told not to ask questions." Alexander looked directly at her. "Who told you that?" Lily swallowed before answering. "The steward said the order came from someone within the royal household." A heavy silence settled over everyone present. The suspicion that had quietly haunted the palace was no longer merely a fear. Someone with authority had been secretly interfering with the king's treatment for months. Queen Mother Victoria slowly lowered her eyes, visibly shaken by the realization that the danger had come from inside the palace itself. Alexander turned toward Commander Brooks. "No accusations until we have proof," he said calmly. "I want facts, not rumors." Brooks nodded immediately. "The palace will be sealed until every record is examined." As the guards began securing the apothecary, Elder Samuel quietly unfolded another page recovered from beneath one of the fallen ledgers. Across the bottom was an official royal authorization bearing a familiar wax seal. It belonged not to a healer, not to the commander, and not to the king. Samuel looked up slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. The permission allowing these medicine changes came directly from the office of the Queen Mother. No one spoke for several long seconds. The royal apothecary, usually filled with the quiet rhythm of careful work, had become a place where every breath seemed too loud. Elder Samuel continued holding the recovered document in both hands, his weathered eyes fixed upon the royal seal pressed into the wax. Queen Mother Victoria stepped closer, studying the page herself before slowly closing her eyes. "The seal is mine," she admitted calmly. Commander Nathan Brooks immediately looked toward the guards, but Alexander raised his hand before anyone could move. "Let her speak," he said. His voice remained steady, neither angry nor uncertain. Victoria looked first at her son and then at Emily. For the first time since the wedding, the dignity she always carried seemed burdened by genuine regret. "Months ago," she began quietly, "when every healer believed Alexander would not survive, advisors from every corner of the kingdom filled these halls with conflicting recommendations. New medicines arrived almost daily. Every document requiring royal authorization passed across my desk. I approved them because I believed I was saving my son. She looked again at the damaged records scattered across the table. I never reviewed every mixture personally. I trusted those responsible for preparing them. Elder Samuel nodded slowly. Then someone used your authority without your knowledge. The chief pharmacist suddenly stepped forward, visibly shaken. There is something I failed to report, he confessed. Several treatment requests arrived already carrying the Queen Mother's seal. Because the authorization appeared genuine, I never questioned them. Commander Brooks immediately ordered every archived prescription brought into the room. One by one, the documents were arranged across the long wooden table. As the healers compared signatures, dates, and ingredients, a troubling pattern slowly emerged. Most authorizations were authentic. A smaller group, however, carried subtle differences almost impossible to notice unless every page was examined side by side. The handwriting matched almost perfectly, but the wax impressions had been pressed slightly off-center. Someone had carefully reproduced the Queen Mother's official seal. Emily quietly stepped closer, her attention drawn not to the signatures but to the sequence of dates. She gently pointed toward 3 prescriptions containing the unfamiliar herb. These were all delivered on evenings when the king became weaker the following morning, she said softly. The room fell silent again. The youngest healer quickly checked his treatment journal before looking up in astonishment. She is right, he whispered. The pattern matches exactly. Alexander turned toward Emily with quiet admiration. She had noticed what everyone else had overlooked, not because she held authority, but because she paid attention when others assumed they already knew the answers. Elder Samuel smiled gently. The Moonborn gift has never been limited to healing, he said. Its greatest strength has always been discernment. Queen Mother Victoria slowly walked toward Emily until they stood face to face. When you first entered this palace, she said with visible emotion, I saw only an unwanted Omega sent here because no one else accepted the marriage. I never imagined the kingdom's greatest hope had been standing before me from the beginning. Emily lowered her eyes respectfully. I only wanted His Majesty to recover. Alexander carefully crossed the room despite the protests of the healers. Though still regaining his strength, every step reflected the confidence of the king his people remembered. He stopped beside Emily and gently took her hand before the entire royal council. No silver light appeared this time. None was needed. Every person present had already witnessed enough to understand the truth. Alexander looked around the chamber with calm authority. This kingdom judged her by a title instead of her character, he declared. While others searched for power, she quietly chose compassion. While others argued over my future, she protected it without asking for recognition. No one challenged his words. Heads slowly bowed throughout the room, not because a king demanded it, but because every heart present recognized that the quiet Omega they had dismissed had become the reason hope still lived within the palace. The palace that had once echoed with whispers of doubt now welcomed the first morning in many months filled with quiet hope. Sunlight poured through the tall stained glass windows, casting ribbons of silver and gold across the great hall where nobles, advisors, healers, and servants gathered in respectful silence. There were no celebrations filled with prideful speeches, only the peaceful understanding that something extraordinary had changed the kingdom forever. King Alexander Hayes stood before his people without the walking staff that had supported him only days earlier. His strength had returned little by little, not through miracles that demanded applause, but through compassion that had asked for nothing in return. Beside him stood Emily Carter, wearing the same calm expression she had carried from the moment she first entered the palace. She had never demanded recognition. She had never reminded anyone of the sacrifices she quietly made while everyone else searched for answers in the wrong places. Alexander looked across the crowded hall before gently reaching for Emily's hand. Every eye followed the simple gesture. When I stood at the edge of losing everything, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. Many believed power would save me. Others believed knowledge alone would restore me. They were all mistaken. I stand here today because one person chose kindness when she had every reason to walk away. Silence settled over the hall as his words reached every corner of the room. Alexander turned toward Emily with quiet gratitude. On the day we were married, everyone believed you had been sent here because you were unwanted. They believed you were the weakest person in this kingdom. They judged your worth before learning your heart. They looked at your title and never saw your courage. Emily lowered her eyes, humbled by the attention she had never sought. Alexander smiled gently before continuing. I was supposed to protect you as your king. Instead, you became the one who saved me. More than one servant quietly wiped away tears. Lily smiled proudly from the back of the hall, while Commander Nathan Brooks bowed his head with sincere respect. Even Queen Mother Victoria stepped forward and addressed the gathering herself. The greatest mistake this palace made was believing greatness always announces itself with power, she said. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carrying nothing except compassion and unwavering character. She turned toward Emily and offered a graceful bow that stunned every noble present. One after another, members of the royal court followed her example. The same people who had once laughed during the wedding ceremony now lowered their heads before the woman they had failed to understand. Elder Samuel Ashcroft stepped forward carrying an ancient silver circlet engraved with delicate moonflowers, a symbol preserved for generations but never worn within living memory. With Alexander's approval, he carefully placed it upon Emily's head. Today, he announced, the Moonborn line is remembered once more, not because of ancient blood alone, but because its true purpose has been fulfilled through mercy, wisdom, and selfless love. The hall remained perfectly still before warm applause gradually filled the room, not loud or triumphant, but heartfelt. Emily looked around at the faces surrounding her and realized the greatest victory had never been proving people wrong. It had been proving that kindness could survive suspicion, humility could outlast pride, and quiet courage could change an entire kingdom without demanding recognition. As the palace doors opened and morning light poured across the marble floor, Alexander gently intertwined his fingers with hers, and together they walked forward toward a future no longer defined by fear or prejudice, but by the simple truth that a person's greatest strength is never found in the title they carry, but in the heart they choose to share with others.